On May 27th of this year, Netflix unveiled Volume 1 of the fourth and penultimate season of the Duffer Brothers' 80s sci-fi horror drama, Stranger Things, and the internet exploded. And for good reason too. This season had just about everything going for it. It tackled mass hysteria, post-traumatic stress, the Cold War, junk science, grief, abuse, and an incredibly on-the-nose villain origin story. Here's my hot take. I found the season to be messy and inconsistent plot-wise, and I'm honestly pretty frustrated with the Duffer Brothers for wasting the potential of so many once great characters. I swear to God, at this point, Joe Keery is like the writer's get-out-of-jail charm card, and they are swiping that poor man left and right like nobody's business. However, I still found Season 4 of Stranger Things incredibly compelling, because it provided the perfect jumping-off point for two of my favorite things: fandom and rabbit holes. And man, this thing was a goldmine. But let's start with fandom. One of the biggest elements of Season 4 that had audiences everywhere swooning was the introduction of new fan-favorite side character Eddie Munson, the lovable social outcast portrayed by Joseph Quinn, who listens to heavy metal and loves Dungeons & Dragons. Eddie takes Mike, Dustin, Lucas, Erica, and co. under his wing as the leader of Hellfire Club, an after-school meetup for kids on the lower rungs of the social ladder at Hawkins High. Unfortunately, due to his unusual appearance, preferences, and reputation as the town drug dealer, Munson ends up becoming the #1 suspect in the gruesome murder of Hawkins High cheerleading captain Chrissy Cunningham. Fueled by mob mentality, the town of Hawkins begins a manhunt for Eddie Munson, operating under the assumption that Munson is part of a satanic cult. It's a classic tale of a social pariah whose outlier status makes him the perfect target to incite a moral panic. It's easy to see why he's become a fan favorite despite his appearance being so short-lived. He's easy to root for. You don't even have to be the target of a righteous mob to understand him either, because anybody who's ever felt like an outsider can identify with Eddie. But the origins of Eddie Munson's character go way deeper than that. And even for the uninitiated who have never seen Stranger Things, I'm sure Eddie's story is beginning to sound eerily familiar to you. And that's because Eddie Munson is based on one of the most high-profile miscarriages of criminal justice in American history.
So much bad stuff is going on in this town, and we know that Satanic Panic was happening around this time. So when we were started to talk about that in the writer's room, that we wanted that to be a part of the season because our kids play Dungeons and Dragons, and it led us to talking about Paradise Lost and the West Memphis 3 and Damien Echols.
In 1993, 3 teenage boys from West Memphis, Arkansas, known as the West Memphis 3, Damien Echols, Jesse Miskelly Jr., and Jason Baldwin, were wrongly convicted for the murder of 3 Cub Scout boys: Steve Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers. The murder victims' bodies were found in a muddy creek. I will not be showing any imagery for obvious reasons. If you're interested in looking into the case for yourself, I will link several sources in the description below. There was 0 DNA evidence linking Echols, Miskelly, or Baldwin to the crime at all, and still, all 3 men were found guilty by a court of law. Jesse Miskelly and Jason Baldwin were sentenced to life in prison, and Damien Echols was given the death penalty. The so-called evidence that the court presented was a coerced confession from Jesse Miskelly that the police clearly tortured out of him because he couldn't get a single detail of the crime scene right in every single version of the story. Also, several witnesses testified that they were with him on the night of the murder, so his alibi was airtight. However, the fact that Damien Echols was interested in the occult, listened to heavy metal, and suffered from mental illness in the past was enough for the jury to conclude that he was the ringleader carrying out these murders as a form of satanic ritual abuse. The trial was marked by tampered evidence, false testimonies by witnesses who later recanted their statements, and a public outcry of mass hysteria. It didn't matter that there was no sufficient DNA evidence linking the West Memphis Three to the crime. The court of public opinion had already decided for them. The trials, convictions, and aftermath of the West Memphis Three was extensively chronicled in the HBO docuseries Paradise Lost, which presents what happened to them as an echoing symptom of the Satanic Panic, a highly publicized moral outcry in the 80s and 90s consisting of over 12,000 unsubstantiated claims of satanic ritual abuse throughout North America. This moral panic was littered with high-profile criminal cases and conspiracy theories that led parents, law enforcement, and pseudo-psychologists to believe that kids and teenagers were being lured into satanic cults by heavy metal records and none other than the popular role-playing fantasy game Dungeons and Dragons. Sound familiar? In creating the character of Eddie Munson, it's very clear that the Duffer Brothers loosely based him on Damien Eccles. He's a charismatic oddball who loves Metallica and loves playing fantasy games to escape from reality. His opening monologue perfectly sets the scene for the cultural backdrop of the Satanic Panic that was sweeping North America at the time.
Dungeons and Dragons. At first regarded as a harmless game of make-believe, now has both parents and psychologists concerned. Studies have linked violent behavior to the game, saying it promotes satanic worship, ritual sacrifice, sodomy, suicide, and even murder.
And while we may laugh at the ludicrousness of the Satanic Panic nowadays, it was no laughing matter at the time. People were seriously fearful, especially in the suburbs, that their kids were being lured into satanic cults. Nowadays, the Satanic Panic serves as one of the most infamous cautionary tales of how innocent people's lives can be tarnished for no reason at all other than fear. As Jen Gershon wrote in Capital Daily, the Satanic Panic destroyed lives and ripped apart families. Reports of ritualistic child abuse were reported across the English-speaking world. Almost all of them were eventually found to have been partially or wholly fabricated, but not before dozens of innocent people were falsely accused and sentenced to years and even decades in prison. When people think about the roots of the Satanic Panic, they often trace it back to Manhattan Beach, California, where the infamous McMartin preschool trial took place. But according to experts, the actual spark that initially set off the Hellfire has its roots in British Columbia, Canada. In 1980, Michelle Remembers, a now discredited work of nonfiction by Canadian psychiatrist Dr. Lawrence Pastor, was published, detailing the memories of his former patient Michelle Smith, who he claims to have cured of repressed memories of ritual abuse at the hands of a satanic cult that her family was part of. The phenomenon of buried or repressed memories is also explored in Stranger Things Season 4 in the scenes between Eleven and Dr. Brenner. Michelle Remembers provided a template for the oncoming slew of satanic ritual abuse allegations that were made against daycare workers in California, Jordan, Minnesota, New Jersey, Tennessee, Arkansas, and Miami, Florida. The most high-profile case was the McMartin preschool trial in California, where the children reported unsubstantiated claims of being taken to a building where they described being tortured, forced to drink blood, and even perform sexual acts with the adults and with each other. It was later revealed that the so-called experts who had come in to question the McMartin children had been instructed to use Michelle Remembers as a guidebook to manipulate and coax the answers that they wanted out of the children. The McMartin trial didn't just ruin the lives of the accused, but it was also reported to be one of the most expensive trials in American history, with the government spending 7 years and over $15 million on a trial that ultimately led to 0 convictions. To quote Sarah Marshall, "It's not even fair to call them the stories of children. because what I think we end up with is the adults going in with a story and then getting children to confirm it. If you watch the videos of the McMartin children who are being questioned, there's a lot happening. There's often a maneuver where they will be given toys and puppets to play with and told to play pretend games, and then asked, how does this action correspond with what you experienced at the daycare? How does this relate to our line of questioning? And children are imaginative. Children want to make adults happy. And children also know that if they're in a situation where a stranger is pressuring them to confirm a story, they don't really have power in that situation, and it might make sense to go along with it. The McMartin preschool trial led to no convictions, but did the panic end there? Of course not. The Reagan and Bush eras were plagued by stranger danger, a fear of your own neighborhood, and so-called experts convincing adults all over America to trust nobody, not even their own friends and neighbors, for fear that they too could be involved in an underground network of satanic cults. This was genuinely the type of mental gymnastics that adults would use to rationalize suicide, mass shootings, ritual abuse, and murder. It couldn't possibly be a form of abuse coming from within the home, or untreated mental illness or trauma. It had to be Satan. These adults were even led to believe that Satan was corrupting their kids through innocent popular cultural staples, like TV shows about talking horses, and as we already discussed, Dungeons and Dragons, and hidden messages in popular music.
All right, I'll slow this down a little bit. Listen for "Here's to My Sweet Satan."
Here's to my sweet Satan.
Did y'all hear that?
In 1969, the Munson killings put a final nail in the coffin of the hippie movement and ritualistic killings on the brain. That same year, Anton LaVey, the high priest of the Church of Satan, published the Satanic Bible, a treatise that repackaged the philosophies of Aleister Crowley and self-actualization authors, Do What Thou Wilt, and all that. LaVey's affinity for the dark arts was heavily influenced by Crowley, who also served as a pretty key point of inspiration for rock stars like David Bowie, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and many others. But we can't talk about rock music's influence on the Satanic Panic without talking about the origins of heavy metal itself. So for a moment, we're gonna cross the Atlantic, which brings us to 1960s Birmingham, England. At the age of 17, Black Sabbath's guitarist Tony Iommi lost his fingertips on his fretting hand in a factory accident. This led him to fashion homemade finger caps out of molten plastic and leather so that he would still be able to play. Iommi tuned his guitar way down and utilized only the lightest strings to lessen the pain shooting up his arm each time he attempted to play, thus creating a darker, gloomier, much heavier sound than anything rock audiences had heard before. In 1968, when Iommi and bassist Geezer Butler created the unsettling riff to the song Black Sabbath, they were inspired by Gustav Holst's The Planets. At a certain point, Tony dropped the key, creating a descending, flattened progression otherwise known as the tritone, or Diabolos in Musica, the devil's interval. And after mentioning the tritone, it's incredibly necessary that I do some debunking about the chord progression, because contrary to popular belief or what you might have heard before, this so-called devil's interval was never actually banned by the church in the Middle Ages. The tritone was simply avoided because it was considered aesthetically displeasing and difficult to sing. I don't have a degree in music and I'm not a music scholar either, so I would recommend watching Adam Neely's excellent video on the myth of the tritone ban.
This is how we got here today. 1. Early medieval singers didn't like singing tritones, so they invented the Daisian scale. 2. Later 14th Ars Nova composers like Michaud threw a bunch of tritones here and there anyway, just because they sounded cool, but most people still avoided them. 3. A cutesy saying about how the sound is a pain to sing is coined probably in the 18th century. 4. 19th century composers wrote music that was based on a cheeky literal reading of this saying, and high drama ensues. 5. Metal music was born very directly from this 19th century retelling of the cutesy saying, Diabolos in musica. 6. Based on metal musicians' desire to seem more evil than the next, we now get the myth that the tritone was banned by the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages.
Geezer Butler had retired his old fascination with Aleister Crowley and the occult, and these song lyrics served as a warning against the power of Satan and against the occult. Later, this trend of occult symbolism and satanic imagery being used by metal bands for branding purposes continued to snowball. And obviously, a good majority of these bands didn't literally practice the dark arts or worship the devil. It was just an aesthetic. Unfortunately for them, conservative religious parents in the 80s and 90s, hell-bent on fantastical thinking, didn't get the message. The most highly publicized example of this was the 1985 PMRC Senate hearings, otherwise known as the Porn Rock hearings. The PMRC is an acronym for the Parents Music Resource Center, an organization founded by 4 Washington women: Tipper Gore, wife of Senator and later Vice President Al Gore; Susan Baker, wife of Treasury Secretary James Baker; Pam Hauer, wife of Washington realtor Raymond Hauer; and Sally Nevius, wife of former Washington City Council Chairman John Nevius. The committee was formed with the goal of increasing parental control over children's access to music that adults deemed to have violent lyrics, drug-related themes, or sexual content. Tipper Gore was the first to start clutching her proverbial pearls over these song lyrics. And here's the real kicker. The catalyst wasn't even a heavy metal record. It was Prince's Purple Rain. Purple Rain! Tipper bought the Prince record for her 11-year-old daughter and was mortified to hear that a number of lyrics, the lyrics to Darling Nikki in particular, tackled female masturbation. According to Gore, her cause for concern was the fact that there wasn't anything on the cover art or the marketing for the album suggesting that it would contain such lascivious lyrical content. Completely oblivious to the fact that Prince was already a well-established controversial artist, and Purple Rain was also the soundtrack to a highly publicized R-rated film of the same name. This was the catalyst for the PMRC starting a censorious war against popular music by compiling a list of songs that they deemed to be the worst offenders, a list that would come to be known as the Filthy 15. Here's the list in full. Darling Nikki by Prince, Sugar Walls by Sheena Easton, Eat Me Alive by Judas Priest, Strap On Robbie Baby by Vanity, Bastard by Motley Crue, Let Me Put My Love Into You by AC/DC, not Highway to Hell? Okay, alright. We're Not Gonna Take It by Twisted Sister, Dress You Up by Madonna, Animal, Like a Beast by Wasp, High and Dry by Def Leppard, Into the Coven by Merciful Fate, Trashed by Black Sabbath, My House by the Mary Jane Girls, Possessed by Venom, and last but not least, She-Bop by Cyndi Lauper. That's quite a sexy list you got there, Tipper. Put a pin in that, because we'll definitely get back to that later.
Don't listen to sexy music, because you will get pregnant and die.
Up until that point, the PMRC had been pressuring the Recording Industry Association of America to establish a rating system where they would put labels on CDs to warn consumers of anything considered distasteful or offensive. These black and white parental advisory stickers we see on albums every day was a direct result of the PMRC's hearing. The PMRC had written the letter to Stan Gordikoff, the president of the Recording Industry Association of America at the time, and proposed a rating system similar to films, which would include X for profane or sexually explicit lyrics, O for occult references, D/A for drugs and alcohol, and V for violence. A highly publicized congressional hearing was held about this proposed rating system in order to raise awareness about this campaign. 3 musicians testified against the proposed rating system at this hearing: Frank Zappa, Dee Snider, and John Denver. The PMRC invited the notoriously white-bread, wholesome, and squeaky clean John Denver to testify at the hearing because they were convinced that he would be on their side and that he would co-sign this censorship campaign. Can you guess what happens next?
I'm here to address the issue of a possible rating system in the recording industry, labeling records where excesses of explicit sex or graphic violence have occurred, and furthermore references to drugs and alcohol or the occult are included in the lyrics. These hearings have been called to determine whether or not the government should intervene to enforce this practice. Mr. Chairman, this would approach censorship. May I be very clear that I am strongly opposed to censorship of any kind in our society or anywhere else in the world.
I wouldn't be surprised if many of you watching at the moment were already aware of this trial, because it was one of the biggest public spectacles of the 80s. We see footage all the time in VH1 and Loudwire countdowns of all the times that heavy metal musicians exposed politicians and reporters for being slimy hypocrites. However, there's a much darker underbelly to this that is a lot more sinister than people might assume. Sure, it's definitely gratifying and hilarious to watch Congress and the PMRC get humiliated by Dee Snider.
Songs allow a person to put their own imagination, experiences, and dreams into the lyrics. People can interpret it many ways. Ms. Gore was looking for sadomasochism and bondage, and she found it. Someone looking for surgical references would have found it as well.
But I really don't see much to be laughing about, because the PMRC had already won.
Okay, the hearing is on September 19th, 1985, right? Mm-hmm. In August, the recording industry had already caved. So basically, as they've done this months-long negotiation with the Washington wives who are pushing all this, the recording industry said, look, it's not going to work to have these specific ratings, warning parents of the specific content of the albums, because logistically it's just too hard. However, we are open to the idea of a generic warning label, right? And we know that this is what we ended up with.
That's pretty good, yeah.
This had already been done a month before the hearing. So basically, everything that they talk about at the hearing is essentially a moot point.
So this wasn't even a real hearing. It was a publicity stunt to distract the public from the real problems happening at the time. Because guess what else was occurring? The Reagan administration was sabotaging HIV/AIDS medical research and robbing the Social Security Trust Fund to pay for his budget shortfalls. Meanwhile, the PMRC were outright blaming higher rates of teen pregnancy on rock and pop records. Did it never occur to them that maybe it was a result of no lucrative sex education in the US or access to any sort of contraception? I'm sure they knew, but they would never acknowledge that, because then that would require them to admit that it was them and the system they worked to uphold that was failing the children, not their rock lyrics and not their silly little fantasy games. And how convenient that the AIDS crisis just happened to be occurring at the time, giving them a perfect excuse to double down on their righteousness and justify their fear of sex. I'm sure we all know by now that people holding disproportionate power are more afraid of sex than they are of violence and murder. So it all adds up. This is the type of rhetoric that's still being utilized against us today. And the saddest part of all of this is that the satanic panic surrounding sex never really went away. There are echoes of it today. Last year, while religious ideologues on the internet were outraged about Lil Nas X's music video, we were living through a record-breaking year for some of the most egregiously anti-LGBT bills in American history. In addition, anti-abortion state laws were sowing the seeds for the eventual overturning of Roe v. Wade. And it just keeps getting worse. Just like the unsuspecting town of Hawkins misplacing their fear on poor Eddie Munson at the same time that Vecna opened the final gate to destroy human civilization, you could almost say that moral panic is the establishment's nefarious way of diverting the public's attention from the real harm and violence being inflicted behind the curtain.